Welcome to American National Government. In this course, you will discuss the purpose, structure, and evolution of United States government.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from American Government, Roots and Reform American Government by Lenz and Holman, and our course-assigned OpenStax American Government textbook. This lecture focuses on precedent, interpretation, and the super-legislator question. The core question is this: at what point does faithful interpretation end and judicial lawmaking begin when precedent, text, history, and modern conditions point in different directions? The core competency is to discuss the characterization of the justices of the Supreme Court as super-legislators. At what point does faithful interpretation end and judicial lawmaking begin when precedent, text, history, and modern conditions point in different directions? The conflict moves through precedent, interpretive method, certiorari selection, constitutional text, and the court's ability to reshape policy while speaking as law. Calling justices super-legislators sounds like a complaint about arrogance. It is deeper than that. The phrase accuses the court of crossing an institutional boundary. Legislatures make policy through voting, bargaining, amendment, and electoral accountability. Courts interpret text, resolve disputes, and follow precedent. When a judicial opinion changes what millions may do, spend, receive, or claim, the question is not only whether the outcome seems good, the question is whether the court reached that outcome through legal interpretation or through disguised policymaking. The debate goes bad quickly when activism and restraint become applause words. If the ruling feels attractive, it gets called principled. If it feels offensive, it gets called activist. That is not analysis. The real work lies in identifying the method, the precedent base, the scope of the holding, the statutory or constitutional text at issue, and the degree to which the court respected or remade the legal framework that existed before the case arrived. The super-legislator question asks whether the court is finding law or making law. That question cannot be answered by pretending judges are machines. Judges choose cases through certiorari, frame questions presented, interpret words, distinguish earlier cases, follow precedent, narrow precedent, or overturn precedent. Those choices can produce wide policy consequences without a single vote cast by the public. The institutional anxiety comes from that gap between consequence and democratic accountability. The civic problem is serious because a republic needs judges capable of checking majorities and presidents, yet it also needs limits on unelected authority. If courts merely rubber-stamped elected branches, rights, and structural limits could collapse under pressure. If courts treated every hard case as an invitation to rewrite public policy, self-government would weaken. The super-legislator critique lives in the unstable territory between those dangers. American constitutional design anticipated some tension here. Federal judges hold life tenure during good behavior, which protects them from direct electoral retaliation. That insulation helps judges decide cases without running for applause. It also means the court can issue decisions with large political consequences while facing no election afterward. Madison's system wanted ambition to counteract ambition, but it did not imagine judges as simple bystanders. A court with review power would inevitably shape the boundaries of public policy. Precedent developed as one restraint on that shaping function. Stare decisis tells judges to follow earlier decisions absent strong reasons to depart. The rule does not eliminate judgment. It channels judgment by forcing the court to explain why an older rule still governs, why a case is distinguishable, or why precedent should fall. That means precedent is both anchor and weapon. It can stabilize law. It can also preserve mistakes or outdated reasoning longer than critics think justifiable. Statutory interpretation adds a parallel set of debates. Courts ask what Congress meant in enacted text, how words fit a larger statute, and whether legislative purpose, structure, or ordinary meaning should control. In some cases, this looks like disciplined legal craft. In others, it looks like policy choice hidden inside arguments about commas, structure, or purpose. Constitutional interpretation carries the problem further because the text is older, broader, and more value-laden. Originalism, textualism, pragmatic reasoning, and living constitutional approaches all claim to discipline judges. None removes judgment. Alternative models existed. The court might have followed a far stricter theory of legislative deference, invalidating laws only in rare and obvious situations. It might have embraced a far more muscular vision of rights and structural review. American practice has oscillated. Some eras emphasize restraint. Others announce more aggressive judicial correction. The role itself has been contested through method, precedent, and political setting. Certiorari power also carries more force than casual observers admit. The court selects a small number of disputes from thousands of petitions. That choice shapes national law by deciding which conflicts deserve settlement, which circuit splits deserve closure, and which controversies can wait. Agenda control itself gives the court quasi-legislative influence because deciding what to decide affects what law will soon become. Statutory canons belong in this conversation as well. Judges use tools about plain meaning, constitutional avoidance, federalism presumptions, and whole text reading to justify interpretations. Those canons look technical, but they can move policy substantially by narrowing agency authority, expanding private rights, or steering ambiguous statutes away from one outcome and toward another. The institutional order behind the problem, therefore, includes more than dramatic constitutional clashes. It includes a judicial hierarchy in which district courts build records, circuit courts create disagreements, and the Supreme Court decides which conflict is ripe for national settlement. It includes stare decisis rules that ask whether a precedent is workable, consistent with related doctrine, and relied upon by public and private actors. It includes interpretive traditions that can pull in different directions when old text meets new technology, new markets, or new claims of equality. The court looks most like a super-legislator when it resets doctrine across a policy field, in one opinion while insisting it only followed method. Precedent also controls lower courts before the public notices doctrine changing. A district judge and a circuit panel must apply Supreme Court rules even when those rules fit badly with a new statute or technology. That hierarchy gives Supreme Court precedent practical force through thousands of routine orders, injunctions, and dismissals long before a new landmark case appears. Picture the court facing a controversial dispute with major policy consequences. The justices do not begin by voting their policy preferences openly. They decide whether to grant certiorari. They frame the question presented. Clerks and advocates parse precedent. Amicus curiae briefs flood the docket from states, advocacy groups, trade associations, scholars, and former officials. The institutional pressure is enormous. If the court takes the case, it signals national importance. If it refuses, lower court law may stand without a final national statement. Once the case is heard, the justices confront multiple restraints and temptations. Text limits them in some ways and leaves room in others. Precedent can control, partially control, or create conflict among lines of cases. Institutional legitimacy pressures the court not to look like a naked political committee. At the same time, some justices may believe precedent is badly wrong and that delay simply preserves constitutional error. A judge committed to restraint may still feel forced to strike a law that clearly crosses a constitutional boundary. A judge committed to robust rights protection may still hesitate if the doctrine would require a sweeping rewrite of multiple related areas. Statutory interpretation illustrates the problem with less constitutional romance. Suppose Congress writes an ambiguous law touching labor, healthcare, environmental regulation, or voting procedure. A court can read the text narrowly, broadly, purposively, or literally. Each path has policy consequences. The judge may insist the method, not the policy preference, drove the result. Critics may answer that method itself contains enough discretion to hide policy choice. That is the super-legislator accusation in smaller form. Precedent fights intensify the point. When the court distinguishes a case, it says the earlier rule remains valid, but does not control here. When it narrows a case, it keeps the shell and drains some force from the center. When it overturns precedent, it admits that legal meaning has shifted enough to justify disruption. Each move can look principled or political depending on consistency, explanation, and timing. The confirmation process amplifies all of this because presidents and senators know judicial method affects policy outcomes. Nominees speak the language of law, restraint, text, and precedent. Interest groups hear future votes on abortion, guns, speech, regulation, religion, and executive power. That does not prove judges are legislators in robes. It does prove everyone surrounding the court understands that interpretive choices can reconfigure public policy on a national scale. Amicus briefs deepen the policymaking appearance because outside actors often write to the court about practical consequences, economic disruption, administrative feasibility, and national alignment alongside legal history. The justices remain judges, yet the materials before them often resemble a policy hearing record in appellate form. Federalist number 78 defended the judiciary as the branch with judgment rather than force or will. That language was written as a reassurance during ratification, a promise that courts would interpret and not govern. The super-legislator critique begins exactly there. Once a court with neither sword nor purse starts dictating national policy through interpretation, the old defense is tested against living practice rather than parchment theory. Stare decisis supplies one answer. The court is not free to invent law each morning because precedent disciplines change. But stare decisis is not mechanical. The court itself decides when precedent has become unworkable, badly reasoned, inconsistent with later doctrine, or intolerable in consequence. That means the restraint operates through judicial choice rather than outside command. For defenders of the court, that is still law. For critics, it often looks like self-policing too gentle to count as a real boundary. Originalism and living constitutionalism present another tension. Originalism promises to tie judges to historically rooted meaning. Living constitutionalism promises a constitution usable in modern conditions. Each claims discipline. Each can produce broad outcomes. The fight is not between law and no law. It is between rival visions of what legal discipline should look like when old text meets new facts. Narrow and broad decisions differ institutionally. A narrow ruling that resolves a specific dispute while leaving many questions open looks less legislative than a sweeping opinion that redesigns a full policy field. Yet narrowness is not always virtue. Courts can hide behind incrementalism and leave confusion in place for years. Broad rulings can clarify law quickly, protect rights, and still appear legislative because they restructure policy at one stroke. This source tension leaves no simple verdict. The court must interpret. Interpretation changes law's practical meaning. The question is not whether judges make choices, they do. The question is what should discipline those choices enough that the judiciary remains judicial. That is why narrow rulings, careful explanation, and transparent method carry so much weight. When the court changes doctrine but refuses to explain why this case required the move, critics reasonably see will rather than judgment. When the court explains how text, precedent, and institutional role combine to support the outcome, it strengthens the argument that the justices acted judicially even while producing large policy effects. Citizens should therefore treat the super-legislator accusation as a boundary question. Ask whether the court grounded its ruling in text, structure, precedent, and method with enough discipline to justify the reach of the outcome. Ask whether the court selected the case to resolve a real legal conflict or to announce a preferred policy direction. Ask whether the opinion respected democratic space where the Constitution allows disagreement, or whether it displaced ordinary politics unnecessarily. That standard will not remove disagreement. Some decisions will still divide the public because the Constitution itself contains broad language, conflicting values, and open-ended guarantees. Yet the standard improves the argument. It moves the dispute from taste to institutional explanation and asks whether the opinion feels judicial or legislative in operational terms. The court's legitimacy depends on that distinction. A judiciary that never checks majorities becomes ornamental. A judiciary that appears to rewrite public policy whenever a majority of justices sees fit will invite open political retaliation and declining trust. Life tenure, certiorari control, and precedent therefore come with a burden. The court must show that its methods constrain its power enough to justify the power scale. The unresolved judgment remains alive at the center of constitutional democracy. When the Supreme Court changes the law's direction, should citizens accept that as lawful interpretation if the method is serious enough, or should they still worry that unelected judges have crossed into policymaking that belongs somewhere else? A mature answer will not pretend the boundary is easy to draw. It will insist that drawing it is part of the citizen's job. The unresolved question is whether precedent restrains judges or gives them a language for changing law without admitting legislative power.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.